Welcome back to the program. Let's go to line number 2. Say good morning to the President and CEO at Newfoundland Labrador Hydro. That's Jennifer Williams. Good morning, Jennifer. You're on the air.
Good morning, Patty.
Welcome to the show. Appreciate your time.
No problem. Glad to be here.
So let's start with the money. So when it was announced by the Premier at the Rooms, talk about $17 billion over the course of the next 17 years. And the takeaway was $1 billion a year. Here we go. That's a lot of money. But it's not quite as simple as that. I can understand the concept of the back-end loading here. But next year, if the MOU becomes a contract, we go from 0.2 to 1 cent per kilowatt hour for Hydro-Quebec. Can you help us understand the progress between now and $17 billion? And when we get to things like 5.9 cents per kilowatt hour, I know there's a lot there, but can you help us under that $17 billion number?
Sure. And Patty, feel free to interrupt me along the way. Excuse me. Feel free to interrupt me along the way because I can get very excited about all these numbers and talking about electricity generally, and there is a lot of numbers. I think it's really important that we take the time to understand them. So the $17 billion a year, we are comparing that to what would happen if we did not do this deal. And the amount of money that Newfoundland Labrador Hydro, via its ownership of the Upper Churchill, so the existing Churchill Falls plant, the amount of money that goes to the provincial coffers after we have our payments from Hydro-Quebec and Newfoundland Labrador Hydro to CFLCom, and then we add in water royalties and rentals and the dividends from the ownership, it works out to about $20 million a year or less. So, sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. So, for the very first year, and between the 17th year, so this is the period when we would otherwise be in this existing contract, that's 17 years, the amount of money differential is $17 billion total. So I just wanted to say that really clearly. We've been saying $17 billion because that's the difference in what we would otherwise get, which is almost nothing, to this total of $17 billion. So that's the first piece I just want to talk about really quickly. So then to go back to on an annual basis, so in the first year, as you said, it's not 1 cent a kilowatt hour. I think it's like 1.6 or 1.7 cents a kilowatt hour in the year one that Hydro-Quebec would be paying for every kilowatt hour compared to the 0.2 cents. And so what that translates into then to the provincial coffers for the government is close to $500 million a year. But it escalates every year after that. And I believe using the forecasted amounts of the price indices that we are going to use, it's around 4% a year that the price of the energy purchased and paid for would increase by about that amount. So in year one, it's about $500 million, and in the last year of the 17 years that we're first talking about, it'll be closer to $2 billion. It's like 1.7 or 1.8, and it still continues to escalate at that. Excuse me again. About 1 point. It continues to escalate at that point, about 4%. So it continues way on into billions and billions in the latter decades.
So they're talking about $2 billion a year by 2044, $6 billion by 2060. So in the short reference between now and 2041, is the actual reality $17 billion coming to the province through your entity into the government?
100%. 100%. And yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it is. And basically is in one of the schedules of the MOU that the public can read, and I invite everybody to review it. It can be heavy, and I know that there's a lot of interested people who are reading it and will read it. There's been thousands of people who visited the website over the weekend. I can guarantee you a lot of folks are really understanding it, which is perfect, which is exactly what we want. But in the schedules, it talks about the kinds of indices that the price is going to be tied to go forward. And so the prices will reflect that. So we have, I'm just going to read you out, actually, if you don't mind. The prices are going to be tied to reflective of wholesale market in Quebec, reflective of replacement energy costs in Quebec, and it will reflect the market value in the Northeast. So we have engineered out of this contract a fixed price that doesn't escalate. And one of the things that I think that we have certainly heard over the years is that people are frustrated that how does the value of the energy that gets sold, why can't we get in on that action?
Right.
Well, what we've done with this pricing principle that you'll see, and it's in Schedule F, so it's on page, if anybody wants to review it. Anyway, it's page 26 or 32 in the MOU. So if the price, for example, that we use these indices, that goes up in Quebec or it goes up in Northeast markets, we'll get a piece of that. The words that we've been using to help people understand it's a bit like your mutual fund, right? So you're going to get a little piece of bonds, a little piece of stocks, and you're going to blend all the price around that. So as that price changes in the market, we will also get the value that changes in the market. We will get that value, whereas before it was just stuck and it didn't ever move.
So does that mean that if Quebec is able to achieve a higher price than what is currently understood regarding market value, that we will get a percentage of that increased value or all of that money?
We will get a percentage because, again, this is where you take all of you're tying yourself to several different indicators, not just one, and that's the problem. If we had tied ourselves, let's say, for example, we tie ourselves to just one only, and then that one indice in the future, in 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 years, does not do well, we'd be in the exact same situation. We'd be like, well, why didn't we tie ourselves to something else? So what we're doing is we're tying ourselves to several different indices, and that way we can de-risk that we're going to be in the same situation that we're in now.
Okay, so I guess that's the question, because many people ask me, and it's a complicated one for me to answer, so I'll put it to you. So I guess the cost-benefit analysis and the inherent risk. If Hydro-Quebec is, and will be the customer into the future, they bear the risk of things like floor price, market adjustments, as opposed to we simply are the beneficiary and take on none of the risk, whether we talk about the prices fall and or we pay high wheeling tariffs to go through Quebec and into the northeastern United States. So is that it? Is it a value versus risk assessment?
I'm not sure. I don't want to speak for Hydro-Quebec and how they chose or how they analyze it from a risk perspective. But, what this does, and you can certainly, and I have been, obviously, paying attention to coverage, in Quebec as well. And this is a good deal for them, too. And so they will have said, even with this pricing escalation mechanism where we're tying ourselves to various indices and they're choosing that is okay for them as well, it is still a good deal for them. They will take that and they will compare that to what would be other ways to purchase power in their province. They'll say, this is still a good deal for us. And it's really important that we understand that. And I think that was made clear, over the last number of days that, we cannot think that we're going to reverse 50 years of retribution. We have to be looking forward. This is a deal between the two parties, and it's really important that this makes sense for both us and for them. So I would suggest that they think that this is a good deal for them, and so I'm not sure if I would call that risk-reward, but they would definitely regard this as a good deal for them, or they wouldn't have brought it forward. So, as you know, Hydro-Quebec is a very smart company. They absolutely would have done their analysis, said this makes sense, but we had really good people involved in this process, and it was a number of Newfoundland Labrador Hydro employees, but we also had external experts advising us and working with us, not just in the last number of months, but for the last several years as we worked through the panel's report. So we've been working externally. We've got great people who pulled all this together with us, and between us and Hydro-Quebec, we think this makes sense for both parties. And
for Hydro-Quebec, I mean, the real crown, the jewel in the crown is Gull. But before we get to Gull, let's stick with the Upper Churchill for a second. So there's going to be expansion in power generation at the Upper Churchill. What exactly is our role, risk, and cost associated with expanding power? I think it's some 1,100 megawatts at the Upper Churchill. Sure. So there's two things that are going to be happening at the Upper Churchill. One, Newfoundland Labrador Hydro will take on under CFLCO, and the other one is a brand new powerhouse, as you've just noted, and that'll be 1,100 megawatts. So, say a little more than, or about 20% of what's already there, or 25%, I should say. So what that is going to be, it's a second powerhouse, and that will be constructed, very similarly in the rock and about 200 meters away. 2 units, 550 megawatts each. And that project does not yet have an environmental assessment or any kind of Indigenous IBA or anything all yet. So there's a lot more work to do on that one than there is on Gull Island. But like you said, we'll get to that in a moment. But it's a great project, and it's what it will do is it'll use the same water. So basically, is instead of the plant maxing out at say 5,400 megawatts when everything is running as hard as it can, the plant will be 1,100 megawatts
megawatts, or they'll call it the development at that place, will be 1,100 megawatts higher in total output, which is really important in how customers are using electricity these days. You've heard me talk before about how with electrification, and everyone is getting electric cars, or they're changing their homes to different heating sources. Industrial processes are changing. You need more power on demand, sort of in that moment. And what this project will do, it will allow for that to occur. So, and Hydro-Quebec will be constructing that one. So
for Newfoundland Labrador Hydro, or CFLCO, we are responsible to build and fund the build and assume any potential cost overruns for that 1,100 megawatts.
Nope, sorry, I was getting excited about the project. So that's the Hydro-Quebec one. I'll come to the one from Newfoundland Labrador Hydro in a second. So that 1,100 megawatt one, that is one that Hydro-Quebec is going to be the lead project manager on through the course of the next period of time when we're doing definitive agreements, and certainly during the construction, we will be working with Hydro-Quebec to provide our input. And I have heard some folks, and I want to assure them about concern of Hydro-Quebec managing this project. But I've also heard some folks rightly say that Hydro-Quebec is good at this, and they absolutely are. But we will have our voice heard, and let's think about this too: the practicality of if Hydro-Quebec is doing it, what kind of situation are we going to have? They need this plant to be highly reliable. So we should not have any concern that what they're going to construct is not going to be high quality. It's not going to be responsive, to what it needs. They are putting a lot of money and a lot of, public trust in them to get this done and to build projects not in their province, that they are funding 100%. And they are going to make sure that that plant runs really, really, really well. So I don't have any concerns with regards to that. And I look forward to working with Hydro-Quebec on putting our input into what that plant will look like. Because Newfoundland Labrador Hydro will run that plant after it's constructed in the same way that we run the sister plant, or what will be its sister plant, just 200 meters away at Churchill Falls. So that's how that's working. And just the last point on that is this is where Hydro-Quebec will be paying to our province $3.5 billion to fund our equity requirements for the various projects that we need to undertake in our province. And that project, the 1,100 megawatts at Churchill, that our equity portion, which is the same as the existing Churchill plant, that will be funded from that $3.5 billion, which is a net present value number, not to get too conceited with numbers. Mm-hmm. In actuality, it gets paid out over the next, say, 10 years. It will indeed be $4.8 billion.
Jennifer, is it possible to put you on hold, take a quick break, come back and talk about Gull?
Sure.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you very much. So we'll put Jennifer Williams on hold and take a quick break. Don't go away. Welcome back to the show. Let's rejoin Jennifer Williams on line number 2. Jennifer, you're back on the air.
Okay, great.
So one of the key issues for Labrador was the recall block. So it's being quadrupled, about 1,990 megawatts. People have fundamental questions about exactly how does that work. Does that mean we are buying all that additional power, or it comes as a so-called luxury of the relationship? And if we're paying for it, how much do we pay for it?
We are not getting it as a luxury, but we are indeed paying for it. So that has been one of my coworkers says a bit of the sad silver lining in the existing contract is that Newfoundland Labrador Hydro has also paid that very low price that Hydro-Quebec currently pays for the power that we then provide into Labrador. So as we move forward with our definitive agreements and get those signed, and then after that point in time, Newfoundland Labrador Hydro will then also pay an increased price. But you certainly would have heard the provincial government come out and commit to ensuring rates are not going to increase for residential customers as a result of Newfoundland Labrador Hydro having to pay that higher price in the future. And they're also talking about making sure that we're in touch with and we revisit what does the industrial rates policy look like in Labrador to ensure that we are indeed competitive, and but that we are working with the industrial customers to determine what rates look like for them in the future.
I mean, Hydro-Quebec announced a 3.3% increase for their industrial customers back in August to kick in 2025. So what were we paying an industrial rate for that recall block? I'm trying to recall now what's public and what's not public, Patty. But so Newfoundland Labrador Hydro is paying the same rate, 0.2 cents.
But the industrial customers obviously don't pay that. They pay a higher rate because they have to pay for other costs as well. So I'm not sure if I understand what your question is.
No, I think people have just been asking me exactly what are we paying for that Labrador block, as they call it, that recall block. And I didn't know. I assumed it was an industrial rate, but I didn't know what the implications were for the quadrupling of it. That's all.
Okay, so what I'll do is I'll jump into what the implications were. Well, I think I've probably touched on what the implications were, but I'll just touch on the quadrupling for a minute. So I think I've addressed that rates will be discussed with customers, the larger customers, into the future. Mm-hmm. The residential customers, it's been committed that their rates are not going to change as a result of this, even though we do have to pay more for that. But I just want to touch really quick on the quadrupling. And the way the power is going to come to Newfoundland Labrador Hydro to then work with interested parties to see how do we allocate that power is it's expected, as long as all of the projects are chugging along and moving along, Newfoundland Labrador Hydro could see as much as about 1,000 megawatts in a little over 10 years that we would then have available to industrial customers. So at that point, it's tripling. And then more blocks of power come back to Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro in later years to allocate to new customers or even further expansion of existing customers. And that would then lead to about the quadrupling of power that we would have available. And those last two blocks that we will get over time toward the end, later in the period, we will determine what the price will be for those at that time, but that is like 25 years away. So there's time for us to work with and analyze what customers that would be. But we do have about 1,000 megawatts, and we'll be talking with various industrial customers about what they would like to avail of, as we have been already. We've been working with a number of industrial customers on transmission lines in Labrador. That's been going on for several years. So we're quite pleased to be able to, through this memorandum of understanding, then as we move into definitive agreements, sorry, I think I must be getting a cold, to work with them on then how do we now allocate power to them with regards to what their plans are for development.
Let's move on to Gull. So, it's been considered one of the last greatest hydro development possibilities in the country, maybe in North America, and here we go. Stan Marshall in his exit interview said this is going to get built. So we understand that Hydro-Quebec is going to build it. They're going to be the project lead, manage construction, assume all the risk and responsibility of potential cost overruns, but they talk about the creation of a new entity, 60% or thereabouts owned by NL Hydro, 40% by Hydro-Quebec. So for the basics, we can avail of some 225 megawatts from Gull. But other than the access to that amount of power, what would be a revenue stream or an upside here? Because we know this is exactly what Hydro-Quebec needed and wanted. Long-term, reliable, secure hydroelectricity. What would be the upsides and the input in our role in operations and money coming from Gull?
Mm-hmm. So with regards to Gull Island, I'm going to go back one step and break down a couple of the numbers that you would have heard in the public the other day, because this is where Gull pops into the conversation. And you would have heard the Premier talk about $250 billion of value to the province. And that's not payments that Hydro-Quebec will pay in a power purchase agreement, which is basically their contract and how much they have to pay the entity that they're buying the power from. So the $225 billion over the life of the agreements is really two big components. One is the existing Churchill Falls plant, as we've already just talked about this morning, and the total value to provincial coffers is resulting from hydro dividends, Newfoundland Labrador Hydro dividends as an owner, plus water rentals and royalties. And that is $180 billion, I believe the number is. Then, when you then add on and go to Gull now is where this comes in. Gull and the second powerhouse at Churchill that you just mentioned, that other power purchases for the upgrades at Churchill, which we didn't talk about. We should go back and talk about that. All of those things plus transmission, Newfoundland Labrador Hydro is going to own the transmission line in Labrador. All of those things together add up to another $45 billion of benefit to the provincial coffers in the coming period of time, under which those contracts are in place. And somebody might ask, well, why are we only making $45 billion out of Gull Island when we're making so much more on the Upper Churchill? And the answer to that is we've been using this analogy. It's like you have two homes, and you as a homeowner, you're renting two houses. One of them you bought back in the 60s, and you've got it fully paid off. The mortgage is paid off. Right now, you're just paying a bit of snow clearing, the light bill, that sort of thing. And you're renting that out to university students. And so pretty much everything that you're paying for that's the profit, right? So it's all the rent mostly goes to profit except for some of the operating costs. That's what the Upper Churchill is. Gull Island, you're going to build a house next door on an empty lot. You're going to do the exact same house, exact same floor plan, and you're going to rent that out to a bunch of university students. You're going to get prices paid for that. But you got to pay your mortgage, right? You've got to pay all those things. So that's why there's a different number for the new developments in total value of the province right now. But think about in 50 or 60 years' time when that house is paid off. We're going to have basically two of these Upper Churchills. You're going to have two plants that are fully paid for, a little bit after 65 years, but you're going to be all fully paid for. And you're going to have this opportunity for future generations to have these wonderful revenue streams opportunities at the time. So I just wanted to talk about that really quick. I'm going to pause there because I mentioned the upgrade at the existing plant, but I don't think we talked about that if you want to go back and talk about it.
We kind of did talk about the addition of second underground powerhouse, but what are you referring to in particular with the upgrades at the upper?
Yeah, so that's another project. So what that one is so really when you'll hear about the projects that are happening is really four projects. One is Gull Island, as you've mentioned. One is the second powerhouse with 2 units, brand new powerhouse. One is the transmission line, which I just briefly mentioned. And then there's a third project that will take place over 11 years. And that's to take the existing plant, and there's 11 units there, and change out some key equipment, one a year, one project a year, essentially 1 unit a year for 11 years. And when you change out that equipment, that's, from the 60s and 70s, with modernized, I'll call it, optimized engineering for that new equipment that would go back in, you actually get 50 megawatts per unit back, I'll call it increase. And so what that means then, for the 11 units, after 11 years, you have another 550 megawatts, which is like 2/3 of Muskrat, out of that plant. So you mentioned 1,100 megawatts out of Churchill. That's 1,100 megawatts out of the second powerhouse, but you add on another 550, and that's what you're actually getting out of the Upper Churchill reservoir as is. Then you go back downstream, and that's when you hit Gull Island, and you get to 2,250 megawatts. So that's really the three major generation projects, and then there's the transmission associated with it.
With all of these 4 mega projects in the conversation, is there something that we can point to, or you can point to, something that we need to be aware of regarding inherent risk? Because you describe a lot of things that are virtually risk-free. It's in Hydro-Quebec's best interest to do the best job they can at the Upper Churchill, certainly in their best interest to do the very best job they can do at Gull. Where would be some areas of risk that we should all be mindful of, yourself, the Premier, politicians in the future, and people like myself, ratepayers?
Yeah, so, obviously, one of the risks that we're talking about inside the organization right now, and obviously, we as a negotiating team obviously wanted this to happen. And on balance, it is absolutely the right thing to do. But I think inherent risk in achieving these kinds of incredible opportunities, I think your previous caller had mentioned it, or maybe Patty, you might have mentioned it, is jobs, right? So just getting this work done in an industry that, if you look across Canada, everybody is building electricity supply sources. And so getting qualified people to be able to construct these projects in the time frame that we all really need them to be, I would suggest to you that that's a pretty big risk. It's also an opportunity, right? So, if we have people in the province who would like to get in on this action, I think now is the time for us to be talking about that as a province. Let's see that future ahead of us, and let's see what can we do to make sure that we do indeed avail of it. Are we talking to the schools about here's the kinds of jobs that we're going to be looking for here, because that's both an opportunity for people, but it also helps us mitigate the risk of not being able to get some of these constructed in the timelines that we appreciate or we think we need. And the longer it takes you to build something, because you can't get access to qualified workers, the higher the costs go, right? So I would suggest to you that would be one of the risks that we are keeping an eye on.
Last couple of very quick ones. Has Newfoundland Labrador Hydro landed with a solution for the forecasted demand of power? People always throw around the 150 megawatt diesel generator, or maybe able to use cleaner fluids or fuels to be located at Holyrood. Have we landed on something specific, or is it all further complicated with the onshore wind proposals and all the rest of it?
No, it's not complicated. I'll start with that and I'll work backwards. It's not complicated by the wind proposals. We're talking with the various serious wind proponents frequently, and so we're understanding what their needs are. We are doing various studies to understand how can they both benefit from our interconnection, or how can we benefit from their interconnection. So that is, I'll call it, in hand as much as it can be, when you have a really big project that we haven't looked at before. So that is very iterative, and we are learning more and more about that all the time in our system. But I think we are in good shape with regards to our processes with the Public Utilities Board on what the next steps are for expanding our system for the load growth that we're seeing. In the fall, we spent 4 days. We had 4 days of technical conferences at the Public Utilities Board with all the interveners. So Dennis Brown was there, Newfoundland Power, the industrial customers, Labrador Interconnected. Obviously, we were there, and the Public Utilities Board staff. And we spent 4 long technical days of talking about all the options, all the scenarios, and what we're in the process now of is examining in detail, I guess we're not in detail, but in written format now, answers to their questions. And we do see in the spring that we will indeed be proceeding with 2 applications, or a single application for 2 sources of new supply. One would be a unit at Bay Despair that you've heard me mention before, and one would be a combustion turbine that could use renewable fuels when they're reliably available in the future. So we are proceeding in the spring with that. We're targeting March, I believe it is. That'll be here before we know it. And I just want to make a real quick point is on the Upper Churchill, because that could be a question the public might have is, well, my God, you're getting access to all this power now. Why don't you bring that down and use that on the island? We actually did consider that as we were, because obviously I'm looking after, I'm involved in both files. The team very much looked at, should we reserve, I'll call it a block of power from the Upper Churchill for the island to supply it. And in order to do that, you would have to build another transmission line, because on peak, the Labrador Island Link is essentially full. There's valleys when you could bring some down, but not when you would want to be able to 100% count on it on peak. So you would have to build a second transmission line. And at today's, alternatives, a second transmission line plus power from the Upper Churchill is not a lower cost than the projects that we are suggesting that we do proceed with. However, as I talked earlier, we're going to have access to blocks of power into the future that if those numbers reverse and that it could be cheaper somehow to build a transmission line and bring power from Labrador down to the island, then that could certainly occur. Patty, can I just talk real quick about jobs? If you don't mind, you're probably trying to get to another caller.
Well, is it possible to be put on hold one more time for the news? Because I'm way over time, but if not, we can revisit another day if that's okay with you.
Sure, yeah. I'll stick around.
Okay, there you go. Jennifer Williams on hold. Time for the news. Don't go away. Welcome back. Let's rejoin Jennifer Williams, the President and CEO of NL Hydro, on line number 2. Jennifer, you're back on the air.
Okay, thanks, Patty.
Before you get to jobs, with the addition of the 2 new turbines, 550 megawatts each at the Upper Churchill, any concern with the water required to power them? Because there are some concerns around the world about water levels. So is that a concern of yours regarding those 2 new turbines?
Sure. I mean, we're going to have to do with Hydro-Quebec the various hydrology studies, and that would feed into, I'll call it, the exact outcomes associated with this. But again, if I go back to Hydro-Quebec, I'm sure they're quite familiar. Well, I'm sure they are quite familiar with water availability into the future, and they've published themselves their view of what is happening with regards to water availability into the future and into the future decades. So I think what we know now, I mean, if you think about the fundamental of this project, this is about electrification. And if you believe in climate change, this is a great project to help address climate change. So it's one of those situations that, eventually, please God, help solve the problem itself by helping address climate change issues. But Quebec is, I'd say almost 100%. I know it's not 100% a hydroelectricity province. They know what they're doing with regards to leaning into this project. But what we'll just have to do more than ever before is manage the water go forward, which Newfoundland Hydro does, Hydro-Quebec does, and you're constantly looking at the data and the history and projections go forward, and you're just managing it associated with that. So I'm just personally concerned with water availability as a resident of this province and of the world and climate change, but I'm not concerned that we won't be able to manage it in light of just the processes that we have and how they'll continue to mature over time.
And before we get to jobs, because I do want to talk about that, can you give us an update about the rebuild or some work that has to be done at a turbine at Muskrat Falls and the status of Holyrood regarding some of the refurbishment and what has to be done there leading into this winter? Or is there still work to be done?
Sure. So with regards to Muskrat, this is a project that we are taking on, and some of your listeners, if they pay attention really closely to us, would know that the issue that we had on Unit 2 at Muskrat was a vibration issue that was found, very early in that unit's service life. And we examined what are the options available to us to deal with that. Some of the things you can tolerate, and some of the things that you can't. So we took our time to do all the analysis about what should we do here with this vibration issue. And then after analysis and, with the engineering teams and the consultants, we decided we are going to take this unit out of service, do the permanent repair, and put it back in service. So we've been planning this now for about a year, I would suggest, and the unit's out of service, and it'll be out of service through the winter, but there's plenty of power available, so not concerned. The other question that had been asked of me when we had this unit at Muskrat that needed this vibration issue. And I will tell you this too, because this needs to be made really clear, is we had the vibration issue and it was still existing for a couple of years before we chose to take it out of service. You don't operate in that zone, right? So the units were protected and there was no concern, but we thought long term this is the right thing to do. Obviously, we've been monitoring the other 3 units up there for if there was any similar issues happening, and that isn't the case. So I just want to be really clear about that. And then the second part of your question was about Holyrood. Yep. So with regards to the Labrador Island Link, it is getting more and more reliable all the time. We just had an important pole drop test. You might have seen a little bit on Twitter about it. We kind of notify people that we're doing that just in case there's an impact. But the test went really, really well. And basically, as you got the power flowing down from Labrador to the island over 2 wires, and what we have to do is we have to simulate and actually make one of the lines trip while there's power flowing on it. The power that's on that has to essentially instantaneously flip over onto the other line so that the other line takes all of the load, and it simulates if, ice drops off that and there's a fault or something on the line. And it did that seamlessly, and customers never saw an impact. And that's one of the things that we've been working on with our software developer over the last period of time, is that worked sometimes and it was difficult some other times, but it worked perfectly. So as the Labrador Island Link gets more and more reliable, we are moving Holyrood more to sort of that standby mode. So it is likely that we would probably have Holyrood have 2 units on and 1 available to us this winter because things are going well with the Labrador Island Link. But we also have an equipment issue on 1 of the units at Holyrood. And so the teams are working on that, and that is slated to come back next month.
What would that issue be?
God, Patty, I had everything prepared except for that one.
Okay, no worries. So a couple of quickies, because I know you've been generous with your time this morning. Number 1, this might be some of the politics of it, but have there been preliminary conversations or real conversations about some of the additional monies coming in the door to further stabilize or maybe even bring down Muskrat Falls rates? Because I know that the current rate mitigation plan sort of runs out in 2030. So has that been discussed about monies coming in and Muskrat rates?
So not with me, but I, as you've already said, the existing rate mitigation plan, and that's the other thing too, I'm seeing a little bit of chatter about sort of mixing Muskrat Falls with this plan. I haven't been part of any discussions that talk about using this money for electricity rates, and I'll tell you why. And it's because of the plan that's already been put in place between now and 2030. And I'll project ahead to 6 years out. A government of the time, and really in advance of 2030, will indeed have to say, what are we going to do after 2030, right? So, but for now, right now, the existing rate mitigation plan, government have committed to holding Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro's total rates, so all of our inputs, not just associated with Muskrat Falls, to 2.25% increase. And the way we're able to do that is government has chosen not to take dividends from Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro in that time period. And our financial forecast shows that we should be able to do that with internally generated funds. And I think that's really important for folks to understand why, when I say this exists or this new deal that or non-binding MOU that we've struck with Hydro-Quebec, we don't need that money for rate mitigation, because right now the forecast for the period that you've just mentioned, we have enough internally generated funds to deal with rate mitigation. So, but that means because government's foregoing the dividends, right? So they would have had it otherwise. So it's really important that we do not mix up and suggest that the Upper Churchill deal is going to fund rate mitigation, because that's already taken care of for the next 6 years.
Understood. And then, of course, it's after that date where we will all have those conversations and discussions. Let's talk about jobs, because Hydro-Quebec and the province of Quebec historically very protective of jobs, but when they're building on our resource, on our river in Labrador, what does the benefits agreement look like? Does it simply go like Muskrat, Indigenous community first, then Labrador, then the rest of the island, then the rest of the country and the rest of the world? How can we be confident that those jobs, to the best of our ability inside a benefit agreement, will be afforded to people from this province?
Mm-hmm. Well, so for Gull Island, I think we can be very confident. We did a stakeholder briefing last week just before the media, and we would have had Trades NL and other groups in that briefing to hear what could this mean for them. They are very familiar with the existing environmental release for Gull Island, because it's also the environmental release for Muskrat Falls. So it's well understood, and I could even have somebody text you or email you the benefits policy that dictates how this is going to go. But the reason why I'm very assured about how this is going to work for Gull Island is because in the environmental release for the Lower Churchill project, which was both projects, it was Gull Island and Muskrat Falls. That is still in place. And how the memorandum with Quebec works is that and I think it's clause 2.3M maybe in the document. It talks about for the benefits that go in for the execution of that project, existing or legal obligations have to be met. And so in the MOU it says legal obligations have to be met. There's an existing environmental release. It's all tied up with legislation at the time, and the legislation references a benefits strategy. And in that benefit strategy, which again is the same one that was used for Muskrat Falls, it is exactly as you said, Patty. It's qualified Indian Nation members have to be given preference first, then qualified Labrador residents, then qualified Newfoundland and Labrador residents, and then the rest of the country. And if I want to translate that for folks into what that meant in Muskrat, just to give you a sense, okay, well, that might be what's on paper. What's that practically going to mean? I can understand that would be a follow-up question. 85% of the hours worked at Muskrat Falls were by Newfoundland and Labrador residents. That's not too shabby. And 25% of those residents, of those jobs, were from Labrador. So I think it's proof is in the pudding. That this is I think great, and it's very well laid out. It is very clear. And I want to mention one other thing. With regards to benefits to companies, because that's certainly about the jobs. And Muskrat Falls, with regards to the benefits to commercial companies in the province, $3.6 billion in fees or contracts were paid to Newfoundland and Labrador companies. So this is and so they take that and translate that. If somebody wants to do the proxy and the math themselves, into the amount of money. I think the Premier's quoting, and this is correct, and it has to go up, is at least $33 billion. Right, so I think people can probably scratch it on the notepad themselves what that might mean for what this future could look like very soon.
Last one, I'll let you go. Do you think this project inside the MOU belongs in front of the Public Utilities Board? And this has nothing to do with yourself and Carl or the government of the day. It's just that whole concept of people are conditioned to be disappointed by the big mega project in this province. Do you see any cold comfort or the responsibility of the PUB to have a look at this, to add to the public discourse?
So, Patty, you've heard me say many times, and I would say that any interviewer in any news organization that asks me a question, and from day one, I have always said that I am open to scrutiny. I welcome scrutiny. I think that a lot of the documentation that you see in this MOU is reflective of people who believe in regulatory process, meaning we believe in ensuring we have all of the evidence to show that we've done the right things. The Public Utilities Board has an existing mandate. I'm not sure it's perfect for this scenario, but this is really up to government how they want to take on what that public scrutiny looks like. That the Premier is bringing this to the House in January, and we will continue to answer questions as I am today. You have me back whenever you want to customers, and we will continue to answer and be accountable in whatever way makes sense. I'm just not sure that the Public Utilities Board is the right process for all of this, but we're open to whatever government does suggest is the right thing to do here.
I appreciate your time, Jennifer. Thank you so much.
All right, take care.
You too. Bye-bye.